He woke up every morning before the sun touched the windows of his bedroom. Not because he loved the morning, but because he loved control. His room was wide and cold, with furniture that looked perfect but never felt warm. The curtains opened with one press of a button, and soft light filled the space. He lay in bed for a few seconds, staring at the ceiling, already thinking about money, power, and paperwork. He had worked hard to build his life, or at least that was the story he told himself. He grew up watching rich people from far away, dreaming of becoming one of them. Over time, he learned that money didn't only buy comfort, it bought respect, fear, and silence. He liked that. People listened when he spoke. Doors opened when he walked in, and nobody dared to question him. The house he lived in was huge. It stood tall, behind metal gates, with cameras watching every corner. Inside, everything smelled of polish and expensive air fresheners. The floor shone like a mirror, and nothing ever stayed out of place. He expected perfection. A small stain on the floor or a speck of dust on the table was enough to ruin his mood. He believed poor people were poor because they wanted to be. That idea lived deep inside his mind. He thought they lacked effort, vision, and discipline. Whenever he passed street vendors or beggars from his car, he turned his face away. To him, they were part of the background, not real people with real pain. Inside the house, there was a quiet routine. Workers moved like shadows. They didn't speak unless spoken to. They didn't make eye contact. They worked quickly and silently, afraid of being scolded. Fear was a normal part of their day. Among them was the maid. She was quiet and careful. She cleaned the floors, washed the clothes, and polished the glass until it shone. She never complained. She never slowed down. Every corner she touched looked brighter, even though nobody ever thanked her. He barely noticed her. To him, she was not a person. She was a role, a duty, a moving object in the house. When something was misplaced, he blamed her. When something broke, he pointed at her. He never used kind words. His voice was always cold and sharp when giving orders. One morning, he walked into the dining room and saw that his cup was not in the usual place. His face darkened immediately. "Where is my cup?" he asked loudly, though no one was standing close to him. The maid rushed in from the side, her head bent down. "I'm sorry," she said softly, moving quickly to fix it. He didn't answer. He only watched her with annoyance in his eyes. In his mind, respect was something poor people had to earn by being perfect. A single mistake erased everything. She placed the cup in front of him with steady hands. The tea inside was hot, steam rising like a thin fog. She stepped back quietly, ready to leave. He took one sip and didn't say a word. "No, thank you." No nod. Nothing. Outside the house, the world was very different. Busy roads, noisy markets, and people fighting daily for survival. But he lived in a bubble of silence and glass walls. He rarely stepped into the real world unless it was inside hotels, offices, or private clubs. The maid, however, came from that world. She walked long distances to reach this house every morning. She passed broken sidewalks, open drains, small tea stalls, and children carrying heavy bags instead of school books. She saw life in its raw form every single day. Her life was not easy. She lived in a small rented room with thin walls and a leaking roof. At night, she could hear dogs barking, babies crying, and neighbors talking loudly. But every morning, she woke up and came to work on time, no matter how tired she was. She believed that work was not just a duty, it was dignity. Even when treated badly, she kept her self-respect alive inside her heart. She talked little but thought deeply. She learned to smile quietly at pain. One afternoon, while cleaning the long hallway, she heard him shouting from the phone in his office. His angry voice echoed through the walls. He was shouting at someone about losses, delays, and trust. It was the first time she noticed stress in his voice. She slowed down her cleaning without meaning to. For a very short moment, she saw him not as a powerful man, but as a tired human being. But she quickly pushed the thought away. That was not her place. That was not her world. Later that day, something small happened, but it carried deep meaning. She finished cleaning the guest room and stepped outside to throw away the trash. Near the gate, she saw a little boy standing barefoot. His clothes were torn, and his face was dirty. He was staring inside the gate, not to steal, but only to look. She opened a small part of the gate and asked gently, "Are you hungry?" The boy nodded. She looked around to make sure no one was watching. Then she took a piece of bread she had kept from her own lunch and handed it to him. The boy's eyes widened with happiness. He took it and ran away with a smile. She stood there for a moment, watching him disappear into the crowd. What she didn't know was that someone was watching her. From the upper floor, through the glass, he had seen everything. He had walked to the window to clear his head from work and noticed movement near the gate. He expected trouble. Instead, he saw something he didn't understand. He saw his maid, the invisible woman in his home, quietly feeding a hungry child. He frowned. Why would someone with so little give away food? In his world, people protected what they had. They saved, guarded, locked, and secured their wealth. This act made no sense to him. It stayed in his mind longer than he wanted. That night, as he lay in his soft bed, the picture came back again and again. Not the boy, not the bread, but the calm look on her face when she helped him. He felt something strange inside his chest. Not guilt, not kindness, but confusion. For the first time in a very long time, he wondered something he never imagined he would think. Are poor people really what I believe they are? And that single thought, small and quiet, became the first crack in the strong wall around his heart. She had learned early in life that the world was not fair. Orphans from a young age, she grew up knowing hunger, cold nights, and the sting of loneliness. But she also grew up learning something else. Kindness could exist even in small gestures. Sometimes it could change lives quietly, without the world noticing. Every morning, she tied her worn shoes, brushed her hair into a tidy braid, and left her small room behind. Stepping into the streets that smelled of dust, smoke, and the noise of endless struggle. The street was alive in a way he would never understand. Children ran barefoot, laughing despite dirty clothes. Vendors shouted the prices of fruits and vegetables. Old women sat on low stools, selling homemade snacks. People pushed carts and carried heavy bags. Each face told a story. Each pair of eyes reflected a life of labor and hope. She knew these people by sight, by their needs, and sometimes by their stories. She could recognize a family in trouble just by the way they walked or stood. And when she could, she helped a bowl of rice here, a piece of bread there. Nothing grand, nothing that would bring fame, but small acts that mattered. Her own life was hard. The rent of her small room consumed almost everything she earned. She cooked on a small stove that barely worked, washed her clothes in a bucket, and saved her few coins for emergencies. Every day, she left her home before the sun rose and returned after it had set. Her body ached, her hands were rough, and yet she never complained. Pride was something she carried quietly. Her dignity was hers alone. Back in the mansion, life was precise and silent. She moved from one task to another, cleaning rooms, washing floors, organizing furniture. Every day she watched the man she worked for. He was powerful, rich, and confident, but he was also cold and distant. He believed that wealth made him better, stronger, and superior. To him, people like her were invisible, shadows that existed only to serve. He rarely acknowledged her presence, except when something was wrong. One morning, she noticed him sitting by the window, staring out at the city streets below. His face was calm, but tired. Something had changed in him, though she did not know what. There was a look in his eyes, one she had never seen before. Curiosity? Confusion? Perhaps even a touch of awe at life beyond his walls. She continued her work, careful not to be noticed. But she sensed something different as she went about her tasks that day. She thought about the boy from the street, the one she had helped with bread. The memory of his smiling face warmed her heart. Helping him had been simple, natural. She did not think about reward or recognition. She thought only of what was right. And yet, as she moved through the hallways and polished the marble floors, She realized that her actions had reached someone else's eyes, someone important. Later that day, a man called her into his office. She hesitated at the doorway, unsure if she had done something wrong. His expression was unreadable, a mixture of authority and thoughtfulness. She stood quietly, waiting for his words. "I saw you today," he said, his voice low. Near the gate, she blinked, unsure how to respond. She had not done anything unusual, only helped a child. "You gave a boy bread," he said, still watching her. "Why?" She lowered her gaze, hands folded in front of her. "Because he was hungry," she said simply. He stared at her. No anger, no accusation. Just a raw, unexpected curiosity. "You didn't ask anything in return?" She shook her head. "Why would I?" "He needed it more than I do." He frowned. The idea of helping without expecting something back was foreign to him. In his world, every action had a purpose, a profit, a return. And yet here she was, a woman of humble means, acting purely out of compassion. It unsettled him, but in a strange way, it also made him think. Days passed and he began noticing other small acts. She would share her lunch with a tired worker in the kitchen. She would offer a warm smile to the security guard at the gate. She would quietly tend to a stray animal that wandered onto the property. Nothing was ever said, nothing was ever shown off, but he saw it. And each time, a quiet, unfamiliar feeling grew inside him. He began to remember moments from his own childhood. He had grown up with wealth, yes, but also with loneliness. His parents were distant, too busy to teach him about compassion or empathy. He remembered the small hurts that came with wealth, not being hugged, not being seen for who he was, only being measured by what he could achieve. And now, watching her, he felt a pang of something he had long buried, longing for genuine care. For human warmth, one evening, a sudden storm hit the city. Rain poured down in sheets, drenching the streets and flooding the small alleys. The maid had finished her work late and was walking home when the rain hit. She had no umbrella, no raincoat, only the thin cloth of her uniform. Water soaked her hair, her clothes clung to her body, and the roads became slippery and dangerous. Without thinking, she continued walking, determined to reach her small home. Along the way, she saw a woman struggling with a heavy bag, soaked through the contents spilling into the water. Without hesitation, she ran to help, holding the bag, shielding it from the rain, and guiding the woman to safety. Both were drenched by the time they reached the other side of the street, but the woman smiled through her wet hair and thanked her. Meanwhile, he had looked out from his office window during the storm. He saw her running through the rain, helping the stranger. She moved quickly, carefully, gracefully, despite the weather. Something inside him stirred. He realized that this quiet woman, the one he barely noticed, carried more courage and goodness than anyone he knew. She was alive in a way he had forgotten how to be. That night, he found himself unable to sleep. He thought about her, about the life she led, about the choices she made every day. He thought about how different the world looked from her eyes, and how narrow his own view had been. He felt an unfamiliar sense of shame for the way he had judged people like her all his life. The next morning, he watched her enter the mansion, soaked but composed, her hair dripping water onto the marble floor. She carried herself with quiet dignity, unbothered by the storm or the wet clothes. She went straight to her work, wiping the floors, organizing the rooms, carrying on as if nothing had happened. And in that simple act, she taught him something profound. Resilience was not about wealth or status. It was about heart and courage. He began noticing other things, too. How she treated everyone around her with respect, no matter their position. How she remembered small details about people's lives and needs. How she never complained, never demanded, and never asked for recognition. Her life was hard, yet she carried it with grace and humility. For the first time, he wondered what it meant to live fully, not in luxury, but in humanity. He started asking himself questions he had never asked before. Questions about fairness, about kindness, about the meaning of wealth. And each time he looked at her, he felt a subtle shift in his own heart. Weeks passed, and the change in him became noticeable to those around him. his voice softened slightly when giving orders. He no longer scolded workers for the smallest mistakes. He began listening, observing, and thinking before acting. He could not explain why he was changing, only that something about her presence demanded it. She, on the other hand, remained unaware of the full impact she had. She continued her life quietly, helping where she could, living simply, and treating every human being with respect. Her actions were not grand gestures or attempts to impress, yet they rippled outward, touching lives in ways she could never imagine. And in that small, silent way, a bond began to form, not through words, not through shared wealth, but through quiet observation, mutual humanity, and the slow recognition that kindness and integrity could teach lessons money never could. It was the beginning of a story neither of them knew would change both of their lives forever. It started slowly at first, like a quiet whisper he tried to ignore. His business, which had always been strong and growing, began facing problems. Small mistakes turned into bigger ones. Deals that seemed certain slipped away. Employees who had once been loyal grew distant, frustrated with the pressure and sudden changes in leadership. He tried to control everything, to push back, to fix it with the same confidence and sharpness he always had. But it didn't work. The first time he truly felt fear, he was in his office, looking at the numbers on his computer screen. They were worse than he imagined. Losses piled up, debts grew, and clients he had trusted for years started avoiding calls. His heart raced, his hands shook slightly. And for the first time, he realized that all his money and power might not be enough to protect him. He called meetings with his managers, expecting solutions, expecting loyalty, expecting people to follow his commands without question. Instead, he was met with hesitation, excuses, and a cold honesty he had not wanted to hear. People told him things he didn't want to hear, that his decisions had caused harm, that his pride had blinded him, that his arrogance had driven away support. He grew angry, shouting in the boardroom, slamming files onto the table. But inside, there was a deep, creeping fear he could not erase. Night after night, he lay awake, staring at the ceiling of his bedroom, unable to find a single solution. The walls that had once felt safe now felt like a cage. The luxury that had surrounded him felt empty, meaningless, and hollow. Outside the mansion, life continued. The streets were noisy, vibrant, and alive, but he could not see them clearly anymore. He was trapped in a storm of his own making, unable to understand how quickly his life had shifted. Calls he once ignored now seemed urgent. Letters he never read now felt threatening. Every knock at the door, every email, every message became a reminder of what he had lost. Meanwhile, the maid went about her daily routine as if nothing had changed. She cleaned, cooked, and cared for the home with the same quiet dedication she always had. She noticed that he was quieter, more distracted, but she didn't pry. Her life had taught her patience. She had learned that people reveal themselves in time, that forcing change never worked. One morning, he called her unexpectedly into the office. She entered cautiously, holding the cloth she had used to dust the furniture. She bowed slightly, her hands folded, unsure what he wanted. He sat behind the large desk, not looking at her at first. His eyes were tired, his hair unkempt, his posture slouched. "Sit," he said finally. She obeyed, her expression neutral. "I need help," he said slowly. The words felt strange, even as he said them. He was not used to admitting weakness, not used to asking anyone for anything. But the storm in his life had forced him into humility. "I don't know what to do anymore," he continued. "Everything I built, everything I thought I had, it's slipping. I can't manage it. I need guidance. I don't know, someone to show me the right steps." The maid looked at him quietly. She did not smile, she did not laugh, and she did not scold him for speaking to her in this way. Instead, she nodded slowly. "I will do what I can," she said softly. From that day on, things changed inside the mansion. She became his quiet observer, his silent advisor in small ways. She listened when he spoke about his fears. She watched patterns he could not see. She reminded him of small details, helped him organize his thoughts, and encouraged him to take care of himself instead of rushing into decisions. He felt something strange again, hope. A faint, fragile hope that maybe he could rise again. But he also felt shame. He had judged people like her his entire life, believing them weak, dependent, and unimportant. Now he realized that her strength, patience, and wisdom were far beyond what he had ever seen in people with wealth. Outside the walls of the mansion, the city had not changed. People still struggled, still fought to survive, but he now saw the world differently. He noticed the children working at street corners, the women carrying heavy loads, the elderly sitting alone. He began to understand that life was not about who had more, but about who cared, who persisted, and who remained humane despite the hardships. One afternoon, as he walked through the house after a meeting, he overheard her talking quietly to a delivery boy who had come to the gate. She offered him water and a small snack, even though she had very little for herself. He stopped in the hallway, hidden behind the corner, watching her with fascination. He realized that her acts of kindness were not performative. She did not seek recognition or reward. She simply acted because it was right. For days, he could not stop thinking about it. Every time he saw her, he felt the growing weight of his own failings, his arrogance, his impatience, his harsh judgments. He began to question everything about the way he had lived. Had he really been in control all these years, or had he been blind to the truth that others lived by? Then came the moment that shook him further. A business partner he had trusted completely betrayed him. Deals were canceled, contracts broken, and financial losses multiplied overnight. He felt the ground beneath him crumble. He realized that he had no one to turn to, no family, no friends, no colleagues he could trust. The world he had built on wealth and power was vanishing. Leaving him exposed and vulnerable, in a panic, he retreated to the mansion, wandering the empty halls, his mind racing. He felt a strange emptiness, a void that his wealth could never fill. For the first time, he felt fear without anger, despair without distraction. He felt utterly alone. The maid noticed immediately. She had been cleaning a distant room when she saw him pacing. She approached cautiously, keeping a respectful distance. "Sir," she said softly, "you should rest. You have been working too hard." He stopped and looked at her, and in that moment he realized just how little he had understood life until now. He had treated her as a shadow, a servant, someone beneath notice. And now, in his hour of need, she was the only one who had offered calm, steady presence. He sank into a chair, feeling the weight of everything pressing down. "I don't know what to do," he whispered. Not to her. Not to anyone. Just to himself, but she heard him. "Take it one step at a time," she said simply. "You cannot fix everything at once. Start with what you can, with what is important, and slowly rebuild. You are not alone." Her words were simple, yet they carried a weight he had never experienced before. They were not commands, nor criticism. They were quiet guidance, the kind that comes from experience and understanding. Not from power or authority. He looked at her and realized something he had never imagined. Her life, though poor and full of struggle, had taught her wisdom he lacked despite his wealth. She knew patience, resilience, and compassion in ways he never had to learn. She had faced the world without fear of losing status or pride. And now, she was teaching him what he needed most, how to face loss with courage and rebuild without arrogance. Days turned into weeks. He began following her advice. He organized his finances carefully, reached out to trusted partners, and slowly began to understand the mistakes he had made. Each small victory brought relief, and each lesson taught him humility. The mansion, which had once felt like a palace of isolation and control, began to feel alive in a different way. He watched the maid move quietly through the halls, noticing how she treated everyone with dignity and respect. He began to understand that true strength was not shown through wealth, but through kindness, resilience, and patience. He started to change in small, unnoticed ways. His tone softened with employees. He smiled more often, not forced smiles, but quiet ones. He began to take notice of the world outside the mansion walls, of the struggles people faced, and the small acts of goodness that occurred every day, and always. He watched her. Not to judge, not to control, but to learn. She became the mirror of what he could be, showing him that life was not about money, power, or fear. It was about courage, humility, and care for others. He realized he had never known the true meaning of strength until he saw it in someone who had nothing and gave everything anyway. The fall from power had been devastating, but it was also a gift, a chance to see life and himself through new eyes. And she, quiet and humble, became the guide he never expected, the teacher he never asked for, and the reason he began to see the world, and himself, differently, little by little. He understood that losing everything had opened the door to gaining something far more valuable: understanding, compassion, and a heart that could finally see beyond wealth and pride. The day came when he realized he had nothing left. His office was empty. Deals had fallen through. The few possessions that once symbolized his wealth now felt meaningless. The mansion, which had always been a fortress of security and pride, now felt cold and unfamiliar. He wandered through the empty halls, touching furniture that no longer seemed important, seeing rooms that no longer held joy, and hearing silence that pressed heavily on him. He had fallen further than he had ever imagined, and the world outside was no longer a place where he could hide behind money or influence. He had tried reaching out to former business partners, people he had trusted for years. Many had abandoned him, some had laughed at him, and a few had taken advantage of his vulnerability. He realized that wealth had been a shield, a mask that protected him from the truth about himself and others. Now, without it, he was exposed, stripped bare, and uncertain of what to do next, with no money and no place to go. He found himself standing before the one place he had always taken for granted. The mansion that had once symbolized power and control now became the only place he knew would not reject him. He walked through the gates slowly, hesitating at the threshold, unsure if he even belonged there anymore. He had once treated this home as his kingdom, a place where he commanded respect and obedience. Now it felt strange, almost alien, and he felt smaller than he had ever felt in his life. Inside, the silence was familiar, but heavier. The floors gleamed, the furniture was in place, but the warmth he once felt in his home had vanished. He wandered through the rooms, noticing every detail in a way he never had before: the small cracks in the paint, the faint smell of dust, the way sunlight fell across the carpet. The mansion was still beautiful, but it no longer had the power to impress him. It only reminded him of what he had lost. He found the maid in the kitchen, quietly washing dishes. She looked up as he entered, her expression calm, without surprise or judgment. He expected anger, scolding, or at least confusion. But she simply continued her work, glancing at him briefly before returning to her task. "Sir," she said softly, "you should rest. You look tired." He laughed bitterly, a sound that echoed oddly in the empty room. "Rest? I have nothing to rest for. I have lost everything." She continued washing the dishes, her hands steady and strong. "You still have yourself. You still have your heart. That is more than many have." Her words were simple, but they carried a weight he could not ignore. She did not offer pity or sympathy. She did not mock him or remind him of his failures. She only spoke the truth, quietly and firmly. And for the first time in a long while, he felt seen, not for his wealth, not for his power, not for his achievements, but for the person he was beneath it all. Days passed, and he remained in the mansion, watching her work, observing her care for others in ways he had never considered. She cooked meals, not only for herself, but for the few workers who still remained. She shared food with stray animals she found wandering the property. She mended clothes, organized the small rooms, and carried on with dignity and patience. Every action was quiet, deliberate, and kind. He began to understand the depth of her strength. She had lived her entire life with far fewer resources than he had ever imagined. Yet she had built a life of courage, integrity, and compassion. She had faced hardships he could not begin to understand. yet she carried herself with calm and grace. And she offered him the same care she had always shown to others, even though he had once ignored her completely. One evening, as the sun set and the sky turned a soft orange, he sat in the living room, watching her prepare a simple meal. She moved with quiet efficiency, her hands skilled and sure. She hummed softly, unaware of the depth of his attention. He felt a strange mixture of humility and gratitude. He had judged her, ignored her, and underestimated her entire life. Now, she was the only person who offered him stability, comfort, and guidance. "Why do you do all this?" he asked finally, his voice breaking the silence. "Why do you help people, even when you have so little?" She paused, glancing at him. Her eyes were steady, honest. "Because it is right," she said simply. "Because we are all connected. If I can make life a little easier for someone else, why would I not?" He could not answer. Her words, though simple, carried a weight that made him rethink everything he believed. In his world, actions were measured by profit, by reward, by recognition. But she acted without expectation, without calculation, without thought of reward. And in that, he realized, lay a power he had never understood. He began to follow her quietly, observing her routines, listening to her words, and slowly learning the lessons she taught without even realizing it. She taught him patience, showing him that small, deliberate actions mattered more than grand gestures. She taught him humility, reminding him that wealth and power were not the measure of a person's worth. She taught him kindness, showing him that care and compassion could exist even in the hardest of circumstances. As he learned, he also began to change. He started helping in small ways, offering support where he could, listening where he had once commanded. He found that the act of giving, even in small amounts, brought a warmth he had never known. He began to see people not as obstacles or tools, but as human beings, each with their own struggles, hopes, and dignity. One rainy afternoon, a delivery boy came to the gate, struggling with a heavy package. She rushed out to help him, and he followed instinctively, carrying part of the load himself. They worked together silently, and when the boy smiled, exhausted but grateful, he felt a strange, deep joy. It was the first time in years that he felt true satisfaction, not from power or wealth, but from helping another human being. He began to understand that life was not about what you owned, but how you lived, how you treated others, and how you faced hardships. The mansion, once a symbol of his pride, now became a classroom for lessons in humanity, and she, quiet and humble, became the teacher he never expected. Weeks turned into months. Slowly, he started rebuilding parts of his life. Not the business, not the wealth at least, not yet. First, he rebuilt his heart, his understanding, his perspective on the world. He began reaching out to neighbors, helping where he could, learning the value of patience and empathy. He realized that true recovery was not measured by bank accounts or status, but by the strength of character and the ability to care for others. The maid never treated him differently. She never sought recognition for the role she played in his transformation. She continued her life quietly, helping where needed, offering guidance through action rather than words. And in that quiet, steadfast way, she became the foundation upon which he began to stand again. He also learned to see the world outside the mansion. The children selling newspapers, the families struggling to eat, the elderly sitting alone, all of them became more than background to him. He began noticing small acts of kindness, small victories of human spirit that had always existed but had been invisible to him. And in seeing them, he found a connection he had never felt before, a sense of belonging to a larger, living, breathing world. One evening, after a long day of reflection and small acts of help, he sat by the window, looking at the streets below. He saw her walking toward a small group of children, sharing what little she had, smiling, encouraging, caring. He realized then that she had never changed. It was he who had changed, not because of loss, not because of hardship, but because he had witnessed genuine humanity, unwavering and strong, in someone he had once overlooked. Her life, though quiet and humble, had become a mirror to his own, She showed him that strength was not in wealth, power, or status, but in patience, kindness, and resilience. She showed him that true help comes without expectation. That dignity is not given by society but earned through integrity. And that courage is not the absence of fear, but the persistence to act rightly despite it. He no longer feared the loss of money or status. He feared becoming the person he had been, arrogant, cold, blind to the struggles and goodness of others. He learned that true wealth was measured in human connections, in acts of care, and in the humility to see life clearly, without judgment or pride. And so, with her guidance, silent and steady, he began to walk a new path. One where he could rebuild his life, not on the empty foundation of money and pride, but on the living, breathing lessons of compassion, empathy, and courage that she had lived every day in her quiet, unwavering presence. He found the support he needed not just to survive, but to truly begin again. He woke up one morning feeling different. The mansion, once a symbol of pride and isolation, now felt like a space full of possibilities. He walked through the halls, not as a man commanding his servants, but as someone observing, learning, and appreciating the quiet rhythms of life around him. The sound of footsteps, the gentle hum of the maid going about her work, the soft sunlight filtering through the windows, all of it felt alive, welcoming, and grounding. The weeks and months since his downfall had changed him more than he ever imagined. He no longer measured his worth by wealth or status. He no longer feared losing material things because he had learned that the heart and mind, once awakened, carried a value no money could buy. But the journey had been slow. Every day brought its own lessons. Every moment tested his patience and humility, and through it all, she had been there, quiet, unwavering. Showing him the power of humanity through her simple acts, he began to venture beyond the gates of the mansion more often. At first, it was uncomfortable. The streets were noisy, crowded, messy. He noticed the poverty, the struggle, the desperation he had once ignored. And yet, he also noticed the small victories: a child helping a sibling, a vendor sharing a smile, a woman giving water to a stray dog. Life existed in layers he had never cared to see. He started helping in small ways. Sometimes it was giving money discreetly to a family struggling to feed their children. Sometimes it was offering food to a child playing in the streets. Sometimes it was simply listening to someone, acknowledging their struggles, and giving them respect. Each act, no matter how small, felt heavier in value than any business deal he had ever closed. She continued her work quietly, but he noticed subtle changes. She seemed more relaxed, more confident in her environment, though she had always been patient. She no longer carried the nervous tension she had once had when dealing with him. She moved freely, knowing that he had begun to see her not as a servant or a shadow, but as a person, a guide, and a human being worthy of respect. One afternoon, he watched her through the window as she interacted with neighbors outside the mansion. A woman had fallen, a child had dropped a basket of vegetables, and a stray dog limped along the sidewalk. She moved from one situation to another with ease, helping each quietly and efficiently. She did not call attention to herself. She did not seek thanks. She simply acted because it was right. He realized then how little he had understood about life before. He had been surrounded by people who did things out of obligation or fear. He had been taught that respect was earned through wealth and power. But here was someone with almost nothing, who commanded a quiet respect far deeper than anything money could provide. She had taught him lessons without speaking them aloud, simply through her living example. His own life began to take shape again, but differently this time. He did not rush back into business. He did not seek immediate wealth or recognition. He focused first on rebuilding himself, his patience, his humility, his compassion. He spoke to people in his neighborhood, offering help where it was needed. He spent time with the poor and the struggling, listening to their stories, understanding their needs, and providing support quietly without fanfare. At the mansion, he began to involve himself in daily life, not as a master, but as a participant. He helped carry groceries. He cleaned alongside workers when necessary. And he shared meals with everyone in a spirit of equality. The walls that had once separated him from the world outside seemed to dissolve, replaced by connection, empathy, and shared humanity. She noticed the change. The quiet, steady woman who had once only offered guidance through action now saw the fruits of her influence. He no longer ignored the struggles of others. He no longer assumed that wealth made him superior. He had learned to see people, all people, with respect and dignity. And in that transformation, she found a quiet satisfaction, not for herself, but for him, for the human being he was becoming. One day, he found himself speaking to a young boy who reminded him of the child she had once fed at the gate. The boy was struggling to carry a heavy load of books. Without thinking, he went forward to help, lifting the weight from the boy's arms. The boy looked up at him with wide eyes, unsure if he should trust someone so powerful. He smiled gently, showing the boy that help could come from unexpected places. That evening, sat with her in the quiet kitchen after dinner. They shared no words at first, only the calm presence of two people who understood the depth of hardship and the value of small acts. He finally spoke. "You've changed me," he said softly. "I didn't understand anything before. About life, about people, about myself. You've shown me something I never learned in all my years of wealth and power." She looked at him quietly, not with pride, but with gentle understanding. "I only live my life as best I can," she said. "If it helps you, then I am glad. But the lessons were always there. You just had to see them." He nodded, feeling a warmth he had never known. For the first time, he understood that human connection, empathy, compassion were more important than anything he had ever chased. He felt a deep gratitude for her presence, for her patience, for her guidance, and for the quiet way she had transformed his heart in the weeks that followed. He became known for acts of kindness that were subtle yet powerful. He helped families, supported children's education, and worked to provide clean water and basic necessities to struggling neighborhoods. He did not seek recognition, but people noticed. They spoke quietly of the man who had changed, who had learned to care, who now used his abilities to uplift rather than dominate. Through it all, she remained his quiet anchor. She did not seek credit for his transformation. She did not demand thanks or acknowledgement. She simply continued her life, offering guidance through her actions, showing patience, care, and strength. And every time he saw her, he was reminded of what true humanity looked like: resilience in the face of hardship, kindness without expectation, and courage that did not need recognition. Months later, he found himself walking through the streets of the city with her by his side. He noticed the vibrant life around him, the laughter of children, the struggle of families, the quiet perseverance of people living day by day. And he understood now that his wealth had been nothing without the understanding and empathy he had gained. He remembered his old life, the arrogance, the coldness, the blindness to the struggles of others. He felt shame, yes, but also gratitude. Losing everything had been the greatest lesson he could ever receive. And in that loss, he had found a new beginning, one rooted in humanity, compassion, and respect. One evening, as they sat quietly watching the sunset, he realized he no longer feared the world outside. He no longer measured his worth by possessions or power. He measured it by the lives he touched, the care he offered, and the heart he carried. He understood that life was not about being rich or admired. It was about being human, seeing humanity in others, and acting with kindness and courage, no matter how small the gesture. She looked at him and smiled softly. "You have come far," she said. "Not because of what you have, but because of what you have learned." He nodded, understanding fully now that her guidance had not been about instructions or advice. It had been about example, the living proof that a life of kindness, humility, and resilience could transform even the hardest hearts. He felt a deep sense of peace, a rare and quiet joy. The mansion, the city, the people around him, all of it was part of a world he now understood more fully. He had learned to see beyond wealth and status, beyond judgment and fear. He had learned to care, to help, and to live with integrity in her quiet, steadfast presence. He had discovered the most important truth of all, that life was not measured by what you took, but by what you gave. Not by how high you climbed, but by how gently you lifted others along the way. And not by the power you held, but by the heart you carried. And so, he walked forward into each new day, carrying the lessons she had shown him, living a life of compassion, humility, and hope, never forgetting the maid who had changed his life and shown him what it truly meant to be human. He had lost everything and yet gained more than he could ever have imagined, a heart that saw, a life that mattered, and the quiet knowledge that the simplest acts of goodness could change the world, one life at a time. He woke up to the sound of birds outside his window, a sound he had once ignored. In the past, mornings had been about rushing, schedules, and control. Now, they were about noticing, feeling, and appreciating the world around him. He stretched and walked slowly through the mansion, seeing every detail in a way he had never done before. The sunlight fell across the polished floors. The wind carried the faint scent of the garden outside, and somewhere in the distance, the city hummed with life. The maid was already awake, quietly preparing breakfast. Her movements were calm, methodical, yet full of a gentle energy that seemed to give life to the house. He watched her silently, noticing how she treated every task, no matter how small, with care and patience. She chopped vegetables, stirred pots, and arranged the table with a quiet grace that he had come to admire deeply. She did not hurry, she did not complain, and she did not seek recognition. Every action was an act of service, not to him specifically, but to the life she lived. He realized how much he had missed in life. He had spent years chasing wealth, climbing social ladders, and proving himself, never pausing to see the beauty in simple acts, the value in kindness, or the strength in humility. Now, every moment carried a lesson. Every glance, every interaction, every small gesture had weight and meaning over the past months. He had begun to venture into the world outside the mansion more often. He walked through neighborhoods he had once ignored, noticing the struggles of families, the determination of children, and the quiet strength of the elderly. He had started small projects, helping families with food, providing support for children's education, and improving basic living conditions in the area. Each act, no matter how modest, brought a sense of fulfillment he had never felt in his life of wealth. She often accompanied him, not as an assistant, but as a guide. Her knowledge of the world, her understanding of people, and her innate kindness provided him with insights he could not gain on his own. She introduced him to families who needed help, showed him where his efforts would make the most difference, and reminded him constantly of the value of patience, observation, and quiet action. One afternoon, he found himself sitting with a group of children who were learning to read in a small community center. They looked at him with curiosity and hesitation. They did not know him as a man of wealth, nor did they see him as someone to fear. He smiled gently and began to read to them, helping them sound out words and encouraging their efforts. The joy in their eyes, the small laughter, the eager questions, it was a richness he had never experienced before. He realized that this connection, this simple engagement, was worth more than all the wealth he had ever possessed. Later, as he walked home with her, he reflected on the changes he had undergone. He had lost everything he had once prized: money, power, reputation. But in that loss, he had gained something far greater. He had learned humility, compassion, and the meaning of true human connection. He had learned that life's value was not in possessions, but in the lives we touch, the care we offer, and the respect we give to others, regardless of their status. Back at the mansion, he took time to help with daily chores. He cooked meals, cleaned, and worked alongside staff members, not out of necessity, but to learn, to observe, and to participate. The act of contributing without expectation of reward became a source of quiet joy. He began to see the dignity in all work, the importance of effort, and the beauty of service when done with sincerity. One evening, a man from the neighborhood came to the gate seeking help. He had lost his job, his children were hungry, and he had nowhere to turn. She approached him calmly, listening to his story while he watched, unsure of how to respond. Then she looked at him and said, "We can help. We will find a way." Together they prepared food, offered clothing, and provided guidance on how the man could find work. He realized that her approach was not just charity, it was empowerment, respect, and care. She treated him not as a beggar, but as a human being capable of growth and dignity. That night, he reflected on his own journey. He had once thought that people were poor because they lacked ambition or intelligence. He had judged, ignored, and dismissed countless lives without understanding. Now he saw clearly that poverty was often a result of circumstance, injustice, and lack of opportunity. He saw the strength and resilience that existed in those who struggled daily, and he felt a deep respect for their courage. He began to rebuild his own life, not for wealth or recognition, but to create opportunities for others. He invested time, energy, and resources into projects that helped the community. He established learning centers for children, provided vocational training for adults, and supported health initiatives. But he did it quietly, without fanfare, following the example she had set, helping because it was right, not because it would bring admiration. Through this process, he noticed changes in himself he had never imagined. He no longer felt the emptiness that once accompanied his pursuit of material success. He no longer feared failure in the same way because he understood that value lay not in achievement, but in effort, intention, and integrity. He began to feel a sense of peace, a calm understanding that life's true purpose was not to accumulate, but to give, to connect, and to care. She remained by his side, not as a servant, not as a subordinate, but as a partner in understanding the world. Her quiet wisdom, patience, and resilience became the foundation upon which he built his new life. He realized that he had been given a rare gift, the chance to learn from someone who had known hardship all her life, who had never sought recognition yet had shaped him profoundly one day. They visited a small village near the city. Children ran to greet them, women smiled shyly, and men nodded respectfully. The villagers knew of his efforts, but more importantly, they saw the sincerity in his actions. He helped repair a school roof, organize supplies, and encourage the teachers. But it was her presence that inspired the villagers most. Her calm authority, her kindness, and her dedication had touched their lives long before he had arrived. In those moments, he understood fully that true leadership was not about power or fear, but about empathy, action, and example. The world responded not to force, but to genuine care. He began to see his past arrogance with clarity, the way he had dismissed others, the way he had measured worth by wealth, the way he had blinded himself to humanity. The shame he felt was real, but it was accompanied by gratitude for the chance to change. Months passed, and he continued to grow, both in understanding and action. He reached out to more communities, more families, and more individuals. He learned to listen deeply, to act patiently, and to value the small successes along the way. He realized that change, both personal and social, was not instantaneous. It was gradual, persistent, and often invisible, yet profoundly powerful. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting a golden glow across the city, he sat with her on the steps of the mansion. Silence stretched between them, comfortable and full of understanding. He looked at her, not as a maid, not as someone beneath him, but as a human being who had changed his life in ways he could never fully articulate. "I don't think I could have done this without you," he said quietly. She smiled gently. "You could. You just needed to see. I only showed you the way." He realized then that the journey had never been about guidance alone. It had been about witnessing courage, resilience, and integrity in someone who lived them naturally. He had learned humility, patience, and kindness because he saw them embodied in her actions every day. In the months and years that followed, he built a life of true value. Not wealth, not fame, not status, but a life of compassion, connection, and service. He worked quietly to improve lives, to lift others, and to treat everyone with respect and dignity. The mansion, once a symbol of pride and isolation, became a center of learning, support, and community. And through it all, she remained a quiet presence, a reminder of the lessons that had reshaped him completely. He often thought back to the man he had once been proud, blind and arrogant, and felt a deep sense of humility. Losing everything had been painful, but it had been necessary. Without that fall, he could never have learned to see, to care, and to live fully. And he knew he would never forget the quiet maid who had shown him what it truly meant to be human. Life continued, full of challenges, joys, and small victories. He faced new problems, made mistakes, and experienced setbacks. But now he faced them with a heart that had learned resilience, empathy, and patience. He no longer feared loss, because he understood that true value lay not in possessions, but in kindness, courage, and integrity. And every day, he watched her, learned from her, and carried the lessons she had taught him quietly into every action, every decision, and every interaction. She had changed his life without demanding anything in return, and in that gift, he found the greatest treasure of all, the ability to live fully, to care deeply, and to be truly human. Through her example, he had discovered that life was not about what you have, but how you live, how you love, and how you serve. And in that discovery, he found peace, purpose, and a sense of fulfillment that wealth alone could never provide. He had been lost, and now he was found not by riches or power, but by the quiet strength and humanity of someone he had once overlooked, someone who had changed his life forever. He woke up that morning to a quiet house, the sun spilling softly through the tall windows. The mansion, once a place of cold silence and distance, now felt warm and alive. He walked through the hallways slowly, listening to the subtle sounds of life around him, the gentle footsteps of the maid as she moved through the rooms, the soft clatter of dishes being set for breakfast, and the faint breeze brushing through the open windows all reminded him how much he had begun to notice, to care, and to feel in the past. Mornings had been hurried, filled with schedules, calls, and the weight of responsibilities he had once thought crucial. Now mornings were about observation, about presence, about seeing the world and the people in it. Every detail seemed significant. The way the light fell on the floor, the faint scent of the garden outside, even the sound of birds singing felt important. He had learned to pay attention, to live with awareness rather than just passing through life. She had already started her daily tasks. Quietly, methodically, she moved through the kitchen, preparing food, tidying counters, and setting the table. Watching her, he realized that life itself was a series of small actions, each carrying meaning, each shaping the day in ways that were often invisible. She had always lived this way, naturally, without thought of reward or recognition, and it was through observing her that he had learned the value of patience, diligence, and quiet care. Over the past months, his life had changed completely. He no longer measured success by wealth or status. He no longer feared loss in the way he once had. Losing everything had taught him humility, and he had discovered that true richness lay not in possessions, but in the relationships he nurtured, the people he helped, and the acts of kindness he performed without expectation. He thought back to the streets of the city, to the neighborhoods he had once ignored. Children running barefoot, women carrying heavy loads, men working tirelessly to support their families. He had begun to see them all, to recognize their courage and determination, and in seeing them, he had started to act quietly, steadily, offering help where it was needed without seeking attention. He had learned that small, consistent acts could change lives more than grand gestures ever could. That morning, decided to visit one of the communities he had started helping. He walked with her, noticing how she moved through the streets with ease, greeting neighbors, offering small words of encouragement, sharing what little she could to make life easier for those around her. People responded not just to him, but to her. Her presence carried a calm authority, a silent assurance that kindness mattered more than wealth or power. He realized that she had always understood this, long before he had learned it. They arrived at a small school that had been struggling to provide basic supplies. Children ran to greet them, their faces lighting up with smiles that had nothing to do with him personally. He knelt to help distribute books, pencils, and other materials, noticing how a simple act could brighten a child's day. He began reading to a small group, helping them sound out words, encouraging them to try, to stumble, and to keep going. The joy in their laughter, the pride in their efforts, and the trust in their eyes became a richness he had never known before. She watched him with quiet satisfaction, not speaking, not guiding, simply observing. She had taught him through example, but now she saw the lessons taking root in his actions. He had learned humility, patience, and empathy. He had learned that life's true purpose was not in accumulation, but in care, service, and connection. And in this moment, he realized how far he had come, how much he had changed, and how much more he still could grow. After leaving the school, they walked through the neighborhood, stopping to help wherever needed. A woman struggled with a broken cart. They helped lift and repair it. A man carrying water to his home stumbled. They steadied him and offered assistance. Children called out for guidance on homework. He and she helped patiently. Every action, no matter how small, carried meaning. And he felt a quiet joy in being able to contribute in ways he never could when blinded by pride and wealth. Back at the mansion, the day continued with simple tasks. He cleaned alongside the staff, prepared meals, and organized rooms. Each action reminded him that dignity existed in all work, that respect was earned through effort and care, not status. He had learned to see the value in every task, every person, and every moment. That evening, as they sat quietly on the veranda watching the sunset, he reflected on the journey he had undertaken. He remembered the man he had been, proud, arrogant, and blind to the struggles of others. He felt shame for the way he had treated people, for the judgments he had made, and for the blindness he had lived with for so long. Yet he also felt gratitude. Losing everything, he realized, had been necessary. Without that fall, he could never have learned to see, to care, to live fully. She looked at him quietly, understanding without judgment. "You have grown," she said softly. "Not because of what you have, but because of what you have learned." He nodded, recognizing the truth in her words. She had been his teacher without ever claiming that role. Her life, full of struggle and hardship, had shown him courage, resilience, and integrity. Her quiet acts of kindness had opened his eyes to a world he had ignored and taught him to value humanity over wealth, compassion over pride, and service over control. In the days that followed, he continued his work in the community, building connections, helping families, and creating opportunities for children and adults alike. He learned that change was gradual, often invisible, but profoundly powerful. Every small act of care, every moment of attention, every gesture of respect contributed to a life that mattered not for fame or recognition, but for the difference it made in the lives of others. He also began to mentor others who sought guidance, sharing what he had learned about humility, patience, and empathy. But he did not lecture. He showed, he acted. He lived the lessons every day, embodying the values that had once seemed foreign to him. People began to notice the quiet difference he made, not in grand gestures or displays of wealth, but in consistent, heartfelt action. One afternoon, a young boy approached him, carrying a small notebook and looking shy. "Sir," the boy said softly, "can you help me read this?" He knelt down, opened the notebook, and began to guide the child, encouraging him, correcting gently, and celebrating every small success. The boy's eyes lit up with pride and joy, and he realized that this simple connection, this moment of shared learning, was worth more than any achievement he had once chased. She watched from a distance, smiling quietly. Her guidance had been indirect, but it had been profound. She had taught him not only to see, but to act. She had shown him that real strength was quiet, consistent, and rooted in care. And now he was passing those lessons forward, not through words alone, but through living example. As the weeks turned into months, he found himself reflecting more often. He had learned to see the world and himself with clarity. He had learned that wealth and power could be empty, but integrity, compassion, and humility carried a richness beyond measure. He had learned that true connection came from kindness, patience, and respect, and that every small act could ripple outward, touching lives in ways he could never fully know. He also realized that life's challenges had not ended. There would be setbacks, struggles, and moments of doubt. But now he faced them with a heart strengthened by experience, guided by compassion, and rooted in the lessons she had taught him.